Why did good people still feel lost? At first, the question sounds almost wrong, because most of us were taught a simple idea about life. If you try to be a good person, life should make sense. If you are kind, responsible, and honest, your heart should feel lighter. If you care for others, work hard, and avoid hurting people, then surely your inner world should become peaceful. But many people discover something quietly devastating. That is not how life always works. A person can be deeply good and still feel disconnected from themselves. A person can be loved and still feel unknown. A person can be responsible and still feel empty. A person can be respected and still feel restless. A person can be doing almost everything right on the outside and still wake up with a question they cannot shake. Why do I feel lost when I am trying so hard to live well? That question matters because it reveals something many people never say out loud. It reveals that goodness does not solve every hunger of the human soul. It reveals that character, while beautiful, is not the same as meaning. It reveals that a disciplined life can still be an unlived life. It reveals that someone can spend years being useful without ever feeling rooted. And often the people who carry this feeling are not the loudest people. They are not the most reckless people. They are not always the obviously broken people. Sometimes they are the exact people everyone else admires. The dependable one, the forgiving one, the patient one, the calm one, the one who keeps going, the one who shows up, the one who understands. From a distance they look stable. But if you could sit beside them in the quietest part of the evening, you might hear something else. Not a dramatic collapse, not a loud crisis, just a tired inner voice saying, "I have done so much of what was expected of me. So why do I still feel far away from my own life?" This is what makes the experience so confusing. Because when good people feel lost, they often judge themselves for it. They tell themselves they should be more grateful. They tell themselves other people have it worse. They tell themselves they have no right to complain. They tell themselves to keep going and stop overthinking. They tell themselves that maybe they are simply too sensitive. But emotional truth does not disappear because we shame it. A soul does not become whole because it was told to be quiet. And the ache for meaning does not go away just because someone is polite enough to hide it. So this reflection is not about blaming good people, and it is not about suggesting that goodness is not important. Goodness matters. Integrity matters. Kindness matters. Truth matters. But the human heart needs more than moral effort. It needs meaning. It needs belonging. It needs direction. It needs rest. It needs inner permission to be honest. It needs to know not only how to live correctly, but how to live from the center. That is where many people become lost. Not because they chose evil, not because they rejected wisdom, not because they stopped caring, but because they learned how to live outwardly before they learned how to live inwardly. They learned how to be good for other people, but not always how to be real with themselves. They learned how to carry responsibility, but not always how to interpret desire. They learned how to avoid harm, but not always how to build a life that feels deeply alive. And when a person lives that way long enough, something subtle begins to happen. Their days may be full, but their inner world becomes thin. Their relationships may be active, but their heart feels unheld. Their schedule may be structured, but their spirit begins to wander. They keep moving, but they no longer know what all that movement is for. That is one of the hardest forms of lostness, the kind that hides inside a functioning life, the kind that lives behind a decent smile, the kind that appears in the quiet after the responsibilities are done, the kind that whispers, "Is this all there is? Is this really my life?" When did I become someone who knows how to endure everything but no longer knows how to feel at home within myself? And this is where the conversation must become more honest, because being lost is not always a sign that a person has failed. Sometimes it is a sign that the old way of living has stopped being enough. Sometimes it is a sign that duty has carried someone as far as duty can carry them. Sometimes it is a sign that an identity built on usefulness can no longer nourish the soul. Sometimes it is a sign that the heart is asking to be met, not managed. There is a difference between surviving your life and inhabiting it. There is a difference between being decent and being deeply aligned. There is a difference between doing what looks right and becoming who you were meant to be. And good people often discover that difference later than others because the world rewards them for staying predictable. People like the helper. People trust the responsible one. People praise the person who does not cause trouble. People depend on the one who is steady and self-controlled. But what the world rewards is not always what the soul needs. Sometimes the very traits that made a person admirable also trained them to disappear. Sometimes the person who learned to keep everyone else comfortable slowly lost the ability to hear their own deeper voice. Sometimes the person who became strong for everyone else forgot how to ask what they themselves needed. So before anything else, let this be said clearly. If you have ever tried hard to be good and still felt lost, that feeling does not make you weak. It does not mean your life is fake. It does not mean your efforts were wasted. It may simply mean that your heart has reached the place where surface goodness is no longer enough. It may mean something deeper is asking to be understood. It may mean the next chapter of your life cannot be built only on being needed. It may need to be built on being honest. And that is where the real journey begins. Not with shame, not with performance, not with pretending you are fine, but with the courage to say, something in me is still searching. Something in me is still unsettled. Something in me is asking for a deeper way to live. And maybe that is not the beginning of failure. Maybe it is the beginning of truth. Semicolon, export const audio, part 02 equals backtick. One of the deepest reasons good people feel lost is that goodness is not the same thing as direction. Goodness tells you something about your values. It tells you what you want to protect. It tells you what you do not want to become. It tells you that your conscience is alive. It tells you that you care about right and wrong, about fairness and honesty, about how your actions affect other people. But direction is something else. Direction is the inner sense that your life is moving toward a meaning that feels real.
Direction is the quiet alignment between what you do and who you are becoming.
Direction is the feeling that your days belong to a story you understand. A person can have strong values and still have no felt direction. And when that happens, life becomes morally careful but emotionally unclear. This is part of why so many good people live in a strange form of exhaustion. They know how to avoid the wrong road, but they do not know what the right road feels like when it is truly theirs. They know what would disappoint other people, but they do not know what would actually awaken their own spirit. They know what they should not do, but they do not know what they are called to build. That kind of life can go on for years, sometimes decades, especially if the person is competent enough to make it look coherent from the outside. They finish what must be finished. They answer what must be answered. They carry what must be carried. They become reliable. They become thoughtful. They become someone others lean on. But something essential remains untouched: their own center. This is why a person can wake up in a life they built responsibly and still feel like a stranger inside it. Not because the life is necessarily bad, not because they made terrible decisions, but because many of the decisions were made to preserve approval, avoid guilt, maintain peace, or fulfill duty. And a life driven mostly by duty can remain externally successful while internally unclaimed. That is the hidden cost of living almost entirely from obligation. Obligation can help a person survive difficult seasons. Obligation can make someone dependable. Obligation can keep families and jobs and relationships functioning. But obligation alone cannot make the soul feel rooted. A soul needs more than a list of responsibilities. It needs an answer to why those responsibilities belong to a meaningful life. Without that answer, even good choices start to feel strangely thin. A person may keep doing the right things, but their heart stops recognizing itself in those actions. They become efficient, but not alive. They become admirable, but not inhabited. They become stable, but not inwardly steady. There is another piece here that many people miss. A good person often becomes so focused on not becoming selfish that they never learn how to recognize holy desire. They are suspicious of their own longing. They think if they want something deeply, it might mean they are being self-centered. So they push desire down. They mistrust it. They silence it before it can speak. But not every desire is corruption. Not every longing is vanity. Not every inner pull is selfishness. Sometimes desire is information. Sometimes longing points toward what has been neglected. Sometimes the repeated ache in a person is not temptation at all. It is vocation. It is truth trying to find language. It is a part of the self saying, "Please do not spend your whole life only being correct. Please also become real." Many good people were never taught how to sort desire wisely. They were taught either to obey it blindly or to distrust it completely. But mature living asks for something more nuanced. It asks us to examine desire without shame, to ask what is beneath it, to ask whether it comes from ego, fear, loneliness, old wounds, genuine calling, or the need for a more honest life. And good people often skip that work, not because they are lazy, but because they were rewarded for bypassing themselves. They learned to be useful before they learned to be self-aware. They learned to be agreeable
before they learned to be inwardly awake. They learned to carry responsibility before they learned to interpret their own hunger. That is why so many good people do not know what they want when someone finally asks. The question itself feels uncomfortable. What do you want? Not what do others need, not what is expected, not what keeps peace, not what avoids criticism. What do you want? For many people, that question creates silence, not because they are simple, but because they have not visited that inner room in a very long time. The room where desire, calling, grief, purpose, and selfhood sit together. The room where a person is not a role, not a label, not a function.
Just a soul trying to become honest. And so they live without direction, while still appearing morally solid. They become passengers in lives they manage beautifully. They move through calendars, routines, deadlines, family systems, and social expectations with competence. But deep down, they feel a growing disconnection between movement and meaning. That is when lostness begins to sharpen. Because the soul can tolerate misdirection for only so long before it starts to protest. At first, the protest is subtle, a vague tiredness, a strange envy of people who seem alive, a quiet emptiness after achievement, a restlessness on Sunday evenings, a numbness in places that used to bring joy, a constant sense that something important is being postponed. Then, if ignored long enough, the protest becomes harder to hide. The person starts saying things like, "I do not know what is wrong with me. I have no reason to feel this way. I should be happy, but I am not. I do not know what I am doing any of this for. I feel disconnected from my own life." That is not always depression in the clinical sense. Sometimes it is existential malnourishment. Sometimes it is the pain of living too long without conscious direction. Sometimes it is what happens when a person has spent years making a life that works, but never paused long enough to ask whether it truly fits. Direction does not appear all at once. It often begins with better questions. What part of my life feels borrowed? What part feels true? Where am I living from fear rather than conviction? What do I keep dismissing because it does not fit the role people know me for? What do I always come alive around, even when I try to ignore it? What kind of life would still feel meaningful if no one applauded? These are dangerous questions in the best way, because they loosen the grip of inherited expectations. They expose the difference between being approved and being aligned. They force a person to recognize that a life can look decent and still be internally divided. And for good people, that realization is often painful, because they are not trying to be false. They are not trying to betray anyone. They are not trying to live shallowly. They simply learn to live by outer standards before building an inner compass. So when they feel lost, they often think something has gone wrong. But sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes feeling lost means the deeper self is finally refusing to stay asleep. Sometimes it means the soul is no longer content with duty alone. Sometimes it means a person is being invited to become not less moral, but more fully alive. And that invitation is frightening, because direction always asks for honesty, and honesty eventually changes things. Export const audio part 0. 3 equals backtick. Another reason good people feel lost is that many of them are living with a quiet absence of meaning, even while their lives look full. A life can be crowded and still feel empty. A life can be stable and still feel unexplained. A life can be admired and still feel emotionally homeless. This is because meaning is not the same as activity. It is not the same as success. It is not the same as being needed. Meaning has a deeper structure. It carries coherence, purpose, and significance. A person needs all three more than most people realize. Coherence is the feeling that life makes sense, that your suffering, your choices, your relationships, your regrets, your growth, and your present reality belong to some kind of story. Without coherence, life feels like disconnected chapters. You move from role to role, demand to demand, season to season. But you do not know how it all fits. And many good people suffer here. They look back and do not see a living pattern. They see adaptation. They see sacrifice. They see pleasing. They see survival. They see all the times they shaped themselves around what was required. They see how often they said yes when something in them wanted to say no. They see how many decisions were made in order to preserve peace, avoid conflict, or stay lovable. So when they look at their past, they do not see one continuous self. They see fragments, versions, masks, necessary choices, old loyalties, unspoken grief, compromises they made before they had better language. No wonder they feel lost. How can a person feel grounded in the present if they cannot understand the story that brought them there? Then there is purpose. Purpose is not merely having things to do. It is having a reason to do them that feels larger than fear. Purpose is the sense that your energy is connected to something real, something meaningful, something that reaches beyond maintenance. Many good people do not lack tasks. They lack purpose. Their life is full of motion but low on inner direction. They spend their days handling practical needs, but they are not sure what larger truth their life is serving. That kind of fatigue is hard to explain, because it is not simple laziness. It is not a lack of motivation in the ordinary sense. It is closer to spiritual overuse. The person is constantly expending energy, but almost none of that energy is returning to them as meaning. They are pouring themselves out into structures that may be useful, but not nourishing. They work, they care, they help, they solve, they organize, they remember birthdays, they keep peace, they answer messages, they carry emotional labor no one names. They do what is necessary. But necessity is not the same as purpose. You can spend 10 years being necessary and still not know why your life feels hollow. Then there is significance, and this may be the deepest wound of all. Significance is the feeling that your life matters, not just because of what you contribute, but because of who you are. It is the sense that your existence has worth that cannot be reduced to usefulness. This is exactly where many good people become invisible, because the world often teaches them that their value lies in what they provide. They are appreciated for helping, praised for being steady, chosen for being dependable, needed for being emotionally mature, respected for being calm, relied on for being the adult in the room. But many of them quietly wonder, if I stop giving like this, will I still matter? If I become messy, needy, confused, less useful, less available, less strong, Will anyone still see me? Do people love me, or do they love the version of me that asks for nothing? That is the tragedy of performance-based significance. The person becomes visible as a function and invisible as a soul. They are known as helper, fixer, listener, parent, provider, advisor, calm one. But they are not sure anyone has really met the unguarded person underneath. When that happens, goodness begins to feel heavy. Not because goodness is wrong, but because it has become entangled with identity in a way that leaves no room for vulnerability. The person no longer experiences goodness as love freely given. They experience it as the cost of remaining acceptable. This is a painful way to live, because it creates a constant subtle pressure. Do not disappoint, do not burden, do not need too much, do not get too emotional, do not change too much, do not become difficult, do not make others uncomfortable with your truth. That pressure slowly drains significance from the soul. The person becomes valuable in the eyes of others, but not secure in their own inherent worth. They keep searching for reassurance through being admirable. Yet admiration never fully satisfies the deeper ache to be loved in a more naked way. That is why a successful life can still feel homeless, because success cannot replace significance, and usefulness cannot replace belonging. Once a person loses coherence, purpose, and significance at the same time, lostness deepens into something more existential. They do not simply feel tired, they feel misplaced. They do not simply feel stressed, they feel detached from the deeper meaning of their own existence. They do not simply want rest, they want reconnection. And often this is the point where they start searching in ways they do not always understand. They may chase more success, more discipline, more productivity, more self-improvement, more optimization, more achievements, more recognition, more being needed. But if the deeper wound is a loss of meaning, then external upgrades cannot fully heal it. They may distract, they may energize temporarily, they may soothe the ego for a while, but they do not answer the more ancient ache underneath. The ache to know, what is my life actually for? What story am I living? Why does any of this matter at the level of the soul? Can I belong to my own life in a way that feels whole? This is why some people arrive at milestones and still feel empty afterward. Not because the milestone was worthless, but because the milestone was expected to solve a problem it was never meant to solve. No promotion can tell a person who they are. No applause can restore a disconnected inner life. No amount of admiration can replace the need to feel significant beyond performance. The soul knows the difference. It knows when it is being entertained and when it is being nourished. It knows when it is being praised and when it is being known. It knows when it is being distracted and when it is actually being met. That is why many good people feel strangely moved by quiet things, an honest conversation, a moment alone in nature, a sentence that names their private pain, a prayer spoken without performance, a cup of coffee in silence, a morning where no one needs anything from them. A small act that feels more alive than a large success. Because those moments restore meaning, they return the person to coherence, to purpose, to significance. They remind the heart, you are not only here to function, you are also here to be alive. And that may be one of the central truths of this entire subject. Good people often feel lost not because they have no morality, but because morality without meaning becomes unsustainable. A decent life without deep connection to purpose will eventually feel thin. A responsible life without significance will eventually feel emotionally expensive. A busy life without coherence will eventually feel fragmented. So if a person feels lost, the deeper question may not be, what is wrong with me? It may be, what kind of meaning has gone missing from my life? What part of my story have I never allowed myself to understand? What part of my purpose have I postponed in order to stay safe? Where have I been useful without feeling significant? Where have I been functioning without truly being alive? That is a very different kind of question, and it leads to a very different kind of healing. Many good people do not feel lost because they have bad intentions. They feel lost because their goodness slowly turned into a performance. This is one of the hardest truths to admit, because from the outside, the behavior still looks beautiful. The person is patient, they are helpful, they are considerate, they are self-controlled. They rarely create conflict. They know how to make others comfortable. They know how to keep the atmosphere calm. They know how to absorb disappointment without making a scene. Everything about that can look mature, and sometimes it is, but not always. Sometimes it is fear wearing the mask of virtue. Goodness rooted in love feels spacious. It has freedom in it. It comes from generosity, not panic. It can say yes without self-erasure. It can say no without self-hatred. It can serve without secretly pleading for acceptance. It can care without disappearing. But goodness rooted in fear feels different on the inside. It is tense. It is hyper-aware. It is always monitoring reactions. It is always trying not to become a problem. It is always trying not to disappoint. It is always asking, will I still be loved if I am honest? Will they stay if I set a boundary? Will I still matter if I stop carrying so much? This is where performance begins, and for many people, it begins very early. Maybe they grew up in an environment where peace depended on their behavior. Maybe emotional honesty was treated like trouble. Maybe anger was unsafe. Maybe sadness was inconvenient. Maybe neediness was shamed. Maybe love was warm but conditional. Maybe approval came most strongly when they were easy, impressive, helpful, or emotionally low maintenance. Children adapt to the systems that raise them. If honesty threatens closeness, they learn to hide. If pleasing earns safety, they learn to perform goodness. If carrying others' feelings keeps the family stable, they become emotionally responsible far too early. And because these patterns are rewarded, they often survive into adulthood unnoticed. The person becomes the one everyone admires, the mature one, the wise one, the calm one, the one who never asks for too much, the one who always understands. But underneath that admired identity is often a private exhaustion, because performing goodness is not the same as resting in goodness. Performance requires constant management. You have to monitor tone, monitor facial expressions, monitor emotional impact, monitor what others need, monitor what you reveal,
Monitor what might create conflict. Monitor how much truth is too much truth. Monitor whether your feelings are acceptable enough to share. That is not peace. That is emotional labor. And done long enough, it becomes a way of life. This is why some of the kindest people are also the most tired.
They are not only living their life, they are constantly editing themselves within it. They are not simply being good, they are maintaining goodness as an image. And image management, even when morally impressive, eventually drains the soul. A person trapped in performance becomes deeply vulnerable to praise, because praise confirms the role. You are so strong. You are so kind. You always understand. You never make things harder. You are such a good person. That sounds wonderful. But if the person is secretly exhausted by the role, praise becomes complicated. It feels good for a moment, then it becomes pressure. Now they must remain that person. Now they must not fail publicly. Now they must protect the identity that keeps them lovable. That is how praise turns into a prison. Not because affirmation is wrong, but because the person is being affirmed for the version of themselves that costs them the most. And here is where the lostness grows. Because once someone has spent years being loved for their controlled, useful, emotionally convenient self, they no longer know whether their deeper self is safe. If they become less agreeable, will they still be welcome? If they tell the truth more directly, will people think they are harsh? If they need help, will others pull away? If they stop always being the understanding one, will they still be chosen? This creates an impossible inner split. The person wants closeness, but closeness seems tied to performance. The person wants honesty, but honesty feels dangerous. The person wants to be known, but being known might disturb the image that makes them lovable. No wonder they feel lost. They have become divided against themselves. Part of them keeps performing the safe identity. Part of them quietly longs to stop performing. Part of them wants to remain good. Part of them wants to know whether goodness can still exist without self-abandonment. That is a sacred question. Can I be kind without disappearing? Can I be compassionate without becoming endlessly absorbent? Can I be a good person without making my worth depend on being easy? Can I be loved in my truth, not only in my usefulness? These are not selfish questions. They are the questions performance tries to silence, and until a person faces them, lostness often remains. Because performance can make a life look stable while leaving the real self underfed. There is also a deeper grief here. When someone begins to wake up from performance, they often realize how much of their life was built around being accepted rather than being honest. They see how many times they apologized too quickly, how many times they stayed in the role of understanding when they were actually hurt, how many times they said yes from guilt, how many times they smiled instead of speaking, how many times they confused peace with silence, how many times they called exhaustion maturity. That realization hurts. Not because the person was fake in some malicious way, but because they were surviving through adaptation. They did what they knew how to do. They built an identity that made closeness possible within the emotional systems they had. So the goal is not self-hatred. The goal is integration. To become a person whose goodness comes from freedom rather than fear. A person whose kindness includes truth.
A person whose compassion does not erase self-respect. A person whose humility does not require invisibility. A person whose love is not purchased by constant self-suppression. And that kind of goodness looks different. It still cares. It still serves. It still forgives. It still values peace, but it no longer worships emotional convenience. It can endure discomfort in order to remain true. It can name pain without becoming cruel. It can set limits without feeling evil. It can disappoint people without collapsing into shame. That is what healing from performance begins to look like. Not becoming less loving, becoming more real. And often, that is why good people feel lost for so long.
Because the path back to themselves requires them to risk being known outside the role. It requires them to discover whether love can survive honesty. It requires them to stop measuring goodness by how little space they take up. When they begin doing that, lostness does not disappear instantly, but something changes. The person starts feeling the difference between living as an image and living as a self. And that difference, once felt, can change everything. Semicolon. Export const audio part 05 equals backtick. Good people often feel lost because they are lonely in ways other people do not recognize. Not lonely in the most obvious sense, not always abandoned, not always isolated, not always without friends or family or community. Their loneliness is often more hidden than that. It is the loneliness of being surrounded but not deeply seen. The loneliness of being appreciated but not understood. The loneliness of being useful but not truly known. This form of loneliness is especially painful because it does not always look like loneliness from the outside. The person is involved. They attend gatherings. They reply to messages. They help people. They are included. They may even be the emotional center of their social world. But inside, they carry a quiet ache. No one really knows how heavy it has become to always be this person. That is the loneliness of role-based belonging. People come to you for wisdom, but not always for truth. They trust you with their mess, but they are not always prepared to hold yours. They like the calm version of you. They rely on the stable version of you. They praise the generous version of you. But they may never meet the frightened, confused, grieving, uncertain, more human parts of you. And if those parts are never welcomed, the soul eventually feels homeless even inside connection. Good people often create this problem without fully realizing it. Because they are skilled at making others feel safe, they ask good questions. They notice small changes in mood. They remember details. They know how to offer care. They know how to soften the room. They know how to be emotionally helpful. But in doing all of that, they sometimes disappear from the conversation. They become the one who listens while slowly forgetting how to reveal. They become the one who understands while slowly losing the language of being understood. They become the one who steadies others while never finding out who can hold them. This creates a dangerous imbalance. A person becomes relationally central and emotionally hidden at the same time. People feel close to them, but they do not feel close to anyone in a fully mutual way. That is why some good people go home after spending all day caring for others and feel crushing emptiness. Not because they were not loved at all, but because much of the love they received was attached to the role they played. The role was welcomed. The person beneath the role remained partially unseen. There is another reason this happens. Many good people have learned that their pain can burden others. Maybe they were dismissed before. Maybe their vulnerability was mishandled. Maybe they opened up and were met with quick advice instead of presence. Maybe they were compared, corrected, minimized, or spiritually bypassed. Maybe they were taught, directly or indirectly, that other people's needs mattered more. So they adapted. They became selective, then guarded, then private, then fluent in caring for others without ever really bringing themselves into the room. But the heart does not stop needing witness just because it learned to hide. The need remains, and if it remains unmet long enough, a person begins to feel unreal, not because they do not exist, but because the parts that most need tenderness are never allowed into relationship. This is why being known matters so much. Not admired, not needed, not complimented. Known. Known enough that you do not have to edit every feeling. Known enough that silence around pain becomes unnecessary. Known enough that your humanity is not a surprise. Known enough that you are not only accepted for your composure. Without that, loneliness deepens, and loneliness distorts the inner life. A lonely person often starts believing false things. No one would understand. I should not need this much. I am too much when I am honest. People prefer me useful. I should be grateful and stop wanting deeper connection. I can handle it alone. These beliefs harden over time. They become identity. Then the person no longer merely lacks connection. They distrust the possibility of it. And once a person distrusts being known, they can remain lonely for years even while standing in the middle of community. This is one reason good people feel so lost in crowded lives. Their social world gives contact, but not always belonging. And the soul is not satisfied by contact alone. It wants resonance. It wants to be mirrored in truth. It wants to hear, "I see you," not only, "I need you." This is also where self-betrayal becomes subtle. A person may stop asking for mutuality because they have become identified with being the giver. They feel guilty wanting more reciprocity. They feel ashamed wanting to be chosen without having to earn it. They feel weak for wishing someone would notice their exhaustion before they explain it. They feel almost childish for wanting tenderness. But none of that is childish. It is human. The need to be known is not immaturity. The need to be held in truth is not weakness. The need for emotionally safe reciprocity is not selfishness. It is part of how human beings remain whole. So what happens when this need is unmet for too long? A person starts becoming numb, not because they want to be numb, but because loneliness without language eventually turns into emotional distance. They become less enthusiastic, less excited, less moved. They start feeling tired around people they love, not because the love is false, but because being relationally available has become costly. Then guilt appears. Why am I so withdrawn? Why do I need more space? Why do I feel tired after helping everyone? Why do I want to disappear after social situations? Why do I feel unseen even when others say they appreciate me? These are not random feelings. They are clues. Often they are signs that a person has been emotionally present for others without receiving the same depth of presence in return. The answer is not to become hard, and it is not to reject connection. It is to become more honest about what kind of connection the soul actually needs. Less performance, more truth. Less role, more mutuality. Less admiration, more witness. Sometimes the path out of lostness begins with one dangerous sentence. I am not as okay as I look. Or, I need a place where I do not have to be the strong one. Or, I do not need advice right now. I need someone to stay with the truth of what this feels like. That kind of honesty can change a life, because once a person experiences being known without losing love, something inside starts to soften. The guard itself begins to trust again. The helper begins to become human. The role loosens. The real person breathes. And sometimes that is what lostness was asking for all along. Not a perfect plan, not more admiration, not another achievement, just somewhere, finally, to be real. Good people also feel lost because many of them carry an overburdened conscience. Their mind does not easily let things go. They replay conversations. They revisit mistakes. They think about what they should have said, what they should not have said, what they should have noticed sooner, how they may have disappointed someone, whether they were unfair, whether they missed something important, whether they were selfish without realizing it. This can look like moral seriousness, and sometimes it is. A sensitive conscience is not a bad thing. It can make a person thoughtful. It can deepen empathy. It can prevent cruelty. It can invite accountability. It can help someone grow. But when conscience becomes tangled with shame, it stops guiding and starts imprisoning. That is where many good people get lost. They are no longer simply trying to learn from the past. They are trying to earn the right to move forward. And those are not the same thing. A healthy conscience says, something was wrong. Face it. Repair what you can. Learn from it. Grow through it. A shame-bound conscience says, you were wrong. And because you were wrong, something is deeply wrong with you. You should not rest. You should not move on. You should replay it until you suffer enough to deserve relief. That is not growth. That is punishment dressed as morality. Many good people do not notice when they cross from guilt into shame, because they are so committed to being responsible. They think harsh self-condemnation proves sincerity. They believe that if they stop suffering over the mistake, they are not taking it seriously. They believe that mercy toward themselves would be avoidance, so they keep the wound open. They keep returning to the same memory. They keep rehearsing their failure. They keep measuring themselves by what they regret most. But a person can live in regret for years and never become wiser from it. Suffering is not the same as transformation. Pain is not automatically redemptive. A person does not become clean by hating themselves long enough. This is one of the hidden reasons good people feel lost. They are carrying old guilt in forms that no longer produce fruit. The past has ceased to be a teacher and has become a courtroom, and they are both the accused and the prosecutor. That internal courtroom is exhausting. Every memory becomes evidence. Every flaw becomes a case. Every repeated struggle becomes proof that change is not real. Every human limitation becomes an accusation. When a person lives that way long enough, they stop experiencing themselves as someone in process. They experience themselves as someone always one mistake away
from worthlessness. That creates fear, perfectionism, emotional hiding, chronic self-surveillance, and eventually, lostness. Because a person cannot live freely while constantly defending themselves against their own inner judge. This is especially painful in people who are outwardly compassionate. Often they are kinder to everyone else than they are to themselves. They can imagine redemption for strangers, friends, family, even those who hurt them. But when it comes to their own failures, they become merciless. That contradiction can feel almost invisible. They tell others, "You are more than your mistakes. Growth takes time. Be gentle with yourself. Do not let the past define you."
Then they turn inward and say, "Yes, but not me. I should have known better. I ruined too much. I am old enough to be past this. I do not deserve the same kindness." This is where the soul begins to fracture, because it cannot survive forever on outward grace and inward condemnation. If grace is real, it must eventually be allowed inward, not as excuse, not as denial, but as the condition that makes honest growth possible. Without grace, truth becomes unbearable. A person cannot face themselves clearly if every truth threatens annihilation. Without grace, honesty becomes something people avoid. Why confess what will only destroy you? Why face what will only bury you deeper? That is why grace and truth belong together. Truth without grace crushes. Grace without truth floats above reality. But together they create transformation. Truth says, "Yes, this happened. Yes, this matters. Yes, this needs to be faced." Grace says, "And still, this is not the whole story of who you are. You are not beyond repair. You are not beyond growth. You are not beyond mercy." This matters because lostness often deepens when a person secretly believes they are disqualified. Maybe not from ordinary life, but from peace, from belonging, from inner rest, from joy, from second chances, from fully being known. They keep functioning, but they do so under a hidden sentence, a sentence that says, "You may continue, but you may not be free." What a painful way to live. To move through the world appearing decent while inwardly living under private condemnation. To smile, help, work, care, and achieve while still carrying a secret belief that your worst moments have the final word. No wonder such a person feels lost. They are not only navigating life, they are dragging old verdicts behind them. That is why the work of healing often involves a different kind of honesty. Not merely, "What did I do wrong?" but also, "What have I been carrying that was never mine to carry forever?" What part of this guilt is truly moral responsibility, and what part is shame trying to become my identity? What can be repaired? What must be grieved? What must be learned? What must be released? Sometimes repair is possible outwardly. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes the person who was hurt is gone. Sometimes the season has passed. Sometimes the harm cannot be neatly undone. That is part of what makes being human so humbling. But even then, a person is not doomed to endless self-punishment. They can become wiser. They can become more truthful. They can stop repeating
what they now understand.
They can become the kind of person their pain taught them to become. That is not cheap redemption. That is costly, honest redemption. And for many good people, that is the doorway out of lostness. Not pretending the past did not happen, not calling darkness light, but refusing to let the past become the only source of identity. Because if someone believes they are permanently disqualified by their failures, they will eventually stop inhabiting their own life. They will live on the edges of themselves, careful, controlled, detached, trying not to take up too much spiritual space. But the soul does not heal in exile. It heals in truth held by mercy. It heals when a person can finally say, "Yes, I have regrets. Yes, I have failed in real ways. Yes, I still need growth. But no, my failure is not the whole truth about me. And no, I will not build my identity out of endless self-accusation." That kind of statement is not arrogance. It is one of the deepest forms of humility, because it accepts both reality and grace. It refuses denial, but it also refuses despair. And when that happens, lostness begins to loosen, because the person no longer has to wander through life trying to outrun old shame. They can finally begin walking forward as someone who is still becoming. Export const audio part 07 equals backtick. Good people often feel lost because they confuse love with self-erasure. This confusion is so common that many people do not even recognize it as confusion. They simply call it being a good partner, a good parent, a good friend, a good child, a good person. They assume love means availability. Love means flexibility. Love means sacrifice. Love means understanding. Love means patience. Love means being the bigger person. Love means not making things harder. Love means staying calm. Love means giving more when the other person gives less. At first, that can look beautiful, and sometimes sacrifice really is part of love. Sometimes patience is holy. Sometimes being gentle in conflict is wise. Sometimes staying present in difficult seasons is exactly what love requires. But love changes shape when one person is always the one bending. When one person is always the one absorbing. When one person is always the one understanding. When one person is always the one apologizing first, making room first, forgiving first, accommodating first, shrinking first. At some point, love stops being mutual presence and becomes quiet self-abandonment. That is where many good people get lost. They do not know where devotion ended and disappearance began. The signs are often subtle. They feel tired but cannot explain why. They start resenting people they genuinely care about. They feel guilty for wanting space. They become numb around those they once felt deeply toward. They fantasize about disappearing for a while, not because they hate anyone, but because they are tired of being endlessly available. That is not always a sign of a cold heart. Often it is the heart finally signaling, something has been unbalanced for too long. Resentment is one of the clearest messengers here. Most good people hate feeling resentful. It does not fit their self-image. They want to be generous. They want to be loving.
They want to be patient. So when resentment appears, they often shame themselves for it. But resentment is not always cruelty. Often it is a boundary that has been ignored so long, it has turned into pain. It is the emotional evidence that someone has been overgiving, underspeaking, or silently betraying their own needs in the name of peace. A person may say, "I do not know why I feel so irritated. I do not know why I want distance. I do not know why I feel tired after helping. I do not know why I want to shut down around people I love." But the deeper truth may be, I have been loving without limits. I have been caring without reciprocity. I have been saying yes when my body and heart were asking for truth. I have been abandoning myself so gradually that I hardly noticed it. This is what makes the situation painful. The person is not trying to be selfish.
They are trying to be loving, but because their definition of love excludes themselves, they slowly become emotionally absent from their own life. That is not sustainable. No one can endlessly pour from a place that is never replenished. And if they try, they do not become more loving. They become depleted, then numb, then resentful, then guilty for being resentful, then even more silent, then more lost. What makes this harder is that many good people were praised for over-functioning in relationships. They were thanked for understanding, admired for staying calm, relied on for carrying more, seen as mature because they tolerated what others would not. But praise does not change the cost. If love is sustained by your constant disappearance, it is costing too much. Healthy love is not the absence of boundaries. Healthy love is love with structure. It allows honesty. It allows limits. It allows two people to exist. It allows one person to say, "I care about you, but I cannot keep doing this in the same way. I love you, but I need truth. I want peace, but not the false peace built on silence. I want connection, but not at the cost of becoming invisible." This is where good people often panic, because they secretly believe boundaries are unkind. They think saying no is rejection. They think space is punishment. They think honesty is aggression. They think limits mean they are becoming selfish. But boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are often the condition that keeps love from collapsing into resentment. They are what allow care to remain clean. They make room for truth. They protect dignity. They prevent silent martyrdom from becoming the hidden engine of the relationship. There is also a grief here. When someone starts practicing healthier love, they often discover that certain relationships only function when they stay self-erased. That can be heartbreaking, because it means some forms of connection were built more on access than on mutuality. The relationship felt stable not because it was deeply healthy, but because one person was carrying more than was visible. When they stop carrying it all, tension appears, and that tension can make them question themselves. Maybe I am becoming cold. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I used to be more loving. Maybe I am ruining something good. But often they are not ruining something good. They are exposing something unbalanced. And exposure is painful before it becomes clarifying. This is where lostness can actually become a teacher. A person starts to realize, I am not only lost in life, I am lost in relationships because I do not know where I end and others begin. I do not know how to stay loving while also staying present to myself. I do not know how to be generous without becoming responsible for everyone else's feelings. That realization matters, because the answer is not less love. It is truer love. Love that includes self-respect. Love that includes boundaries. Love that includes speaking before resentment hardens. Love that includes rest. Love that includes the belief that your inner life is not less sacred than anyone else's comfort. Many good people need to hear this more than once. Your needs do not cancel your kindness. Your limits do not cancel your compassion. Your exhaustion is not proof of failure. Your desire for honesty is not cruelty. Your wish to be loved without disappearing is not selfishness. Sometimes the way back from lostness begins with this one shift. Stop asking only, "How can I keep loving better?" and start asking, "What would love look like if I remained fully present too?" That question is not small. It can reshape entire relationships. It can change how a person speaks, rests, chooses, and remains. It can release them from years of silent overfunctioning. And maybe most importantly, it can help them discover that love was never meant to cost them their own selfhood. Love may ask for sacrifice at times, but it was never meant to ask for your permanent disappearance.
Export const audio part 0.
8 equals backtick. There is another reason good people feel lost that is rarely spoken about honestly. Sometimes they are simply tired of living in a world that does not seem to reward the things they value most. They believe in honesty. They see manipulation succeed. They believe in loyalty. They experience betrayal. They believe in compassion. They live inside systems that reward speed, image, status, and advantage. They try to live with integrity. They watch people cut corners and rise faster. They try to be patient. They see aggression mistaken for strength. That creates a quiet kind of exhaustion, not just personal fatigue, moral fatigue. The fatigue of trying to remain human in environments that constantly tempt you toward hardness. This is especially painful for good people because they often expect values to protect them more than they actually do. They expect honesty to create trust. They expect loyalty to create safety. They expect love to be returned by love. They expect kindness to be recognized by kindness. But life is not that neat. And when reality keeps violating those expectations, a person begins to feel disoriented. Not because their values are wrong, but because their values do not give them control over outcomes. That is difficult to accept. A good person may quietly ask, "What is the point of staying honest when lies move faster? What is the point of loving well when people misuse it? What is the point of being gentle if the world seems built for sharper people? What is the point of giving your best if life can still unravel anyway?" These questions do not always come from cynicism. Often they come from heartbreak, from moral injury, from the grief of realizing that goodness is not a transaction that guarantees protection. This is where many decent people begin drifting toward lostness. They are not just struggling with their own inner life. They are also struggling to reconcile their values with the world they inhabit. And if they cannot reconcile the two, they begin to feel as if they no longer know how to live meaningfully inside reality. Some respond by hardening. They stop expecting much. They become more emotionally guarded. They detach from hope. They adopt a quieter cynicism. They tell themselves they are just being realistic now. Others do the opposite. They try even harder. They become more accommodating, more patient, more responsible, more morally serious, almost as if enough goodness will eventually correct the imbalance. But because the world remains imperfect, that strategy eventually wears them down too. The deeper issue is this. Goodness was never meant to be sustained by outcome alone. If someone can only remain kind when kindness is rewarded, their kindness will collapse under disappointment. If someone can only remain honest when truth is celebrated, their honesty will not survive a costly season. If someone can only remain compassionate when compassion is reciprocated, their compassion will slowly harden. So what holds goodness steady when the world is disappointing? Not naivety, not denial, not pretending pain is not pain. What holds it steady is conviction, a deeper reason for living by what is true, a deeper anchor than reward, a quieter understanding that the worth of integrity does not depend entirely on immediate outcomes. That is a hard lesson. But without it, good people often become lost every time life behaves unjustly. They start measuring the value of their heart by how the world responded to it. And the world is too inconsistent to carry that burden. There are seasons when doing the right thing feels lonely. Seasons when truth costs more than silence. Seasons when boundaries offend people who benefited from your lack of them. Seasons when your honesty is called disloyal. Seasons when your tenderness feels almost fragile against the hardness around you. In those seasons, lostness can deepen because the person starts wondering if they are built wrong for the world. Maybe I am too soft. Maybe I care too much. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe my values are not realistic. Maybe survival requires becoming more like the people I do not want to become. That is one of the darkest temptations. Not simply to give up, but to betray your own heart in order to feel less exposed. Many people do not realize how exhausting it is to resist that temptation repeatedly, to keep choosing honesty, to keep choosing integrity, to keep choosing self-restraint, to keep choosing kindness with wisdom, to keep choosing not to let pain make you cruel. That is profound inner work, and if it is done without renewal, it becomes draining. So good people need to understand something very important. Staying good in a hard world does not mean staying endlessly available to harm. It does not mean staying naive. It does not mean calling manipulation compassion. It does not mean confusing forgiveness with access. It does not mean pretending reality is softer than it is. Grounded goodness is different from exhausted goodness. Grounded goodness has boundaries. It has discernment. It sees clearly. It does not romanticize pain. It does not invite repeated harm. It does not measure love by self-sacrifice alone. It does not assume everyone is safe just because you want to be kind. This kind of goodness is stronger, not weaker, because it is not dependent on fantasy. It can face betrayal and still choose not to become bitter. It can face dishonesty and still choose truth. It can face disappointment and still choose integrity. But it does so from rootedness, not denial. That rootedness is what many lost people are missing. They have goodness, but not always the deep, inner anchor required to carry goodness through disappointment. So every painful season starts to feel like a referendum on their whole way of living. And after enough painful seasons, they begin to wonder whether they even know how to continue. This is why many good people need a vision of life bigger than fairness in the immediate sense. They need meaning large enough to survive unanswered questions. They need hope deeper than outcomes. They need some form of faith, whether spiritual, moral, or existential, that lets them say, "I will not let the world teach me to betray what is most true in me." That is not weakness. That is courage. A quieter kind of courage than the world usually celebrates. The courage to remain humane in environments that make hardness look smart. The courage to remain truthful in settings where image is rewarded. The courage to remain compassionate without becoming foolish. The courage to remain morally alive without collapsing into moral exhaustion. And perhaps this is one of the reasons good people feel lost for so long. They are not only carrying their personal pain, they are carrying the weariness of trying to live sincerely in a world that often runs on compromise. That burden deserves to be named, because once it is named, the person stops assuming the problem is entirely inside them. They begin to see that some of their exhaustion is the natural cost of trying to live beautifully in difficult conditions. And once they see that, they can begin asking a wiser question, not, "How do I stay good by force?" but, "How do I become rooted enough that goodness no longer drains me dry?" That is a different path, and it leads toward wholeness, not just endurance. Many good people feel lost because they are afraid to choose their own life. This fear is rarely dramatic. It does not always look like panic. Often it looks like hesitation that stretches for years, a quiet postponement, a long delay in becoming honest, a habit of waiting for permission that never fully comes. The reason is simple and painful. Choosing your own life often means disappointing someone. And for people who built identity around being good, disappointment can feel almost morally dangerous. They can tolerate overwork. They can tolerate emptiness. They can tolerate self-suppression. But disappointing people who depended on their old version of self feels much harder. Because that old version was rewarded. It made people comfortable. It preserved closeness. It kept conflict manageable. It made them lovable in familiar ways. So even when the person begins to sense that a new life is asking to emerge, they resist. Not because they are weak, but because growth often feels like betrayal before it feels like freedom. Especially when the people around you prefer who you were before you became more honest. This is why many good people remain stuck in half-lived lives. They know something needs to change. They know certain relationships are built on old roles. They know certain dreams will not leave them alone. They know certain forms of work drain them beyond reason. They know certain expectations no longer fit. They know their current way of living is thinning them out. And yet they stay, or they delay, or they change only in private, because the cost of full honesty feels too high. There is a hidden tragedy in that. A person can become deeply responsible for a life that does not truly belong to them. They can become good at maintaining a path they never consciously chose. They can spend years proving loyalty to an identity that once kept them safe but no longer lets them breathe. That is one of the loneliest forms of lostness. To realize that much of your suffering does not come from obvious failure. It comes from living too long under inherited expectations. Expectations from family, from culture, from religion, from gender roles, from community, from old survival strategies.
From the version of yourself that learned how to be acceptable before it learned how to be inwardly true. This is why good people often cannot answer simple questions about themselves. What do you want? What kind of life feels true? What are you postponing? Where do you come alive? What are you pretending not to know? The questions sound straightforward, but for someone who has spent years adapting, they feel destabilizing. Because in order to answer them honestly, the person has to step outside the script that defined them. And once they do that, they cannot unsee what no longer fits. That is why many people avoid the question altogether. They stay busy. They optimize. They keep helping. They keep maintaining. They keep preparing for a future they are not sure they even want. But avoided truth does not disappear. It waits, and often it returns in the form of lostness. That restless feeling is sometimes the soul refusing to keep pretending. It is the deeper self saying, "You have followed maps handed to you by others for a long time. When will you ask whether the map leads to your own life?" This is not permission to become reckless. It is not permission to abandon responsibility carelessly. It is an invitation to become conscious, to stop confusing inherited expectation with calling,
To stop assuming that whatever preserves external peace must also preserve internal truth. Many people need to grieve here. They need to grieve the years they spent pleasing, the years they spent being chosen for the wrong reasons, the years they spent shrinking to stay lovable, the years they spent treating desire as a threat, the years they spent postponing themselves because everyone else seemed more certain. Grief is necessary because once a person sees the pattern clearly, they often feel sorrow. Why did I wait so long? Why did I betray myself so quietly? Why did I not trust what I knew? Why did I build so much around approval? But grief can become fruitful if it leads to choice rather than paralysis. Because the truth is, no one becomes whole by endlessly regretting the unlived parts of their life. Wholeness begins when regret turns into honesty, and honesty turns into action. Action does not have to be dramatic. Sometimes it begins with one sentence, one boundary, one changed habit, one conversation, one refusal to keep performing the old role. One step toward the work that actually matters. One act of telling the truth where silence used to live. This is how an inner compass is rebuilt, not through fantasy, through repeated acts of alignment. You stop asking only what will keep others most comfortable, and you start asking what is actually true. Not impulsively, not selfishly, but steadily, courageously. This process is what many people mistake for being lost. They think because they are uncertain, they are failing. But uncertainty is often what happens when a borrowed identity begins to loosen. The old self no longer fits. The new self is not fully formed, and the space between the two feels like confusion. But sometimes it is not confusion. Sometimes it is transition. Sometimes it is growth. Sometimes it is the necessary disorientation of becoming honest after years of adaptation. A person in transition is often misunderstood, even by themselves. Their old life no longer gives the same comfort. Their old answers sound thinner. Their old roles feel tighter. Their old dreams lose force. Their old coping patterns stop working. That can feel frightening, but it can also be sacred. Because many people only begin becoming real when their old ways finally stop sustaining them. This is why it matters not to shame yourself for feeling lost in transition. The feeling may be telling you that your life is rearranging, that your values are clarifying, that your tolerance for false peace is shrinking, that the self built for survival is making room for a self built for truth. A seed underground looks buried from the outside, but burial and becoming can look the same for a while. Likewise, a person in transition may look uncertain, but uncertainty can be the visible shape of deep internal reordering. Good people need to hear this. Feeling lost does not automatically mean you are failing. Sometimes it means you are waking up. Sometimes it means the life that once protected you has become too small. Sometimes it means your heart can no longer live entirely on the surface. Sometimes it means your own life is asking to be chosen by you at last. That is not betrayal. That is responsibility of the deepest kind. The responsibility to become someone whole enough to love, work, serve, and live truthfully. And perhaps that is one of the central movements in this entire journey. The shift from being good in ways others can recognize to becoming honest in ways only the soul fully understands at first. That shift can look like lostness, but often it is the beginning of a truer life. Semicolon. Export, const, audio, part 10, equals, backtick. If good people feel lost for all these reasons, then what does the feeling itself actually mean? What is lostness trying to say? In many lives, lostness is not the enemy. It is a signal, a messenger, a disruption that arrives when the old arrangement of life is no longer sustainable. It is what happens when the soul has tolerated too much misalignment and can no longer remain quiet. That means the question is not only how to escape the feeling, it is also how to understand it. Because if lostness is speaking, then rushing to silence it may only deepen the problem. Many people respond to lostness by trying to fix it quickly. They seek immediate certainty, a new routine, a new goal, a new system, a new identity, a new performance strategy, something to make the discomfort stop. But sometimes the discomfort needs to be listened to before it can be healed. Sometimes clarity comes not from faster answers, but from better attention. Lostness often points to misalignment. Where am I living a life my deeper self does not recognize? Where have I built identity around what is rewarded instead of what is true? Where have I been over-functioning and under-feeling? Where have I been staying in roles that cost me too much? Where has my conscience become shame instead of guidance? Where has love become self-erasure? Where has success replaced significance? Where have I mistaken being needed for being known? These are not easy questions, but they are clarifying questions. And the soul often becomes lost precisely because easier questions have dominated for too long. Questions like, how do I keep everything running?
How do I stay acceptable? How do I avoid disappointing people? How do I remain useful? Useful questions can keep life stable.
But they do not always make life meaningful. And eventually, meaning demands its own set of inquiries. There is something else lostness often reveals. It reveals where a person has confused comfort with peace. Comfort says, stay with what is familiar. Peace says, stay with what is true. Those are not always the same road. Sometimes truth is uncomfortable before it becomes peaceful. Sometimes the most familiar patterns are the ones most responsible for inner disconnection. Lostness can also reveal where a person has been spiritually underfed. Not necessarily in an institutional or religious sense, though it can include that. More deeply, it reveals where the inner life has not been nourished by silence, wonder, reflection, beauty, prayer, truth, presence, real conversation, rest, or meaning. A person can go a long time without realizing they are spiritually hungry, especially if they are efficient, especially if they are admired, especially if they are always moving. Efficiency can hide starvation for a while. So can productivity. So can competence. So can even success. But eventually the emptiness becomes too articulate to ignore. And when it does, many people think they need a more intense life, more challenge, more goals, more motion. But often what they need is a more honest life, a slower life in certain places, a truer life in important places. A life where they stop asking their soul to survive on leftovers. This is why healing from lostness rarely begins with spectacle. It usually begins quietly. A person stops running long enough to hear themselves. They stop numbing with busyness. They stop rewarding themselves only for output. They stop bypassing pain with quick inspiration. They stop outsourcing identity to other people's reactions. Then, in the quiet, things start surfacing. Grief, anger, desire, regret, clarity, longing, truth. Sometimes all at once. This can be overwhelming, and many people are tempted to shut the door again. Because once the inner life begins speaking, it becomes harder to continue living on the surface. But this is often the point where real healing becomes possible, not because the pain vanished, but because the person finally stopped treating inner honesty like a threat. What helps here is recognizing that lostness is often layered. A person may be tired, yes, but beneath the tiredness is disconnection. Beneath the disconnection is longing. Beneath the longing is unlived truth. Beneath the unlived truth is the fear of what honesty will change. When a person understands the layers, they stop attacking the symptom alone. They begin listening for the source. And source-level healing looks different. It asks, what truth have I postponed because it would complicate my life? What need have I shamed because it did not fit my image? What grief have I never allowed to become visible? What part of me have I abandoned in order to stay acceptable? What kind of peace have I been pretending to have because I was afraid of what real peace might require? These questions slow a person down, but slowing down is not failure. Often it is the first act of spiritual intelligence. If you have been living in internal division, speed will not save you. More optimization will not save you. More effort inside the same misaligned structure will not save you.
You need understanding, and understanding requires attention. It also requires permission. Permission to admit that a decent life can still be too shallow. Permission to say that gratitude and grief can exist together. Permission to say that you love people and still need boundaries. Permission to say that you have succeeded and still feel empty. Permission to say that you have faith and still have questions. Permission to say that you are tired of being known only for your strength. That permission is powerful, because many good people do not need more discipline. They need more honesty. And honesty is often what allows lostness to become a guide instead of a prison. Eventually, this process brings a person to a crossroads.
One road leads back to image, performance, avoidance, and familiar self-suppression. The other road leads towards slower truth, toward responsibility without self-erasure, toward love with boundaries, toward work with meaning, toward grief with grace, toward goodness that is rooted rather than performative. The second road may not give instant clarity, but it gives something better. A life that begins to feel inhabited again. A life where the outer self and the inner self are no longer at war. A life where being good no longer requires disappearance. A life where meaning is not borrowed from applause. A life where peace is not purchased by pretending. That is what many people are really searching for when they say they feel lost. Not a perfectly mapped future. An inhabited life. A life where their own soul can finally say, "Yes, I recognize this. This is mine. This is honest. This is alive." And once that becomes the aim, lostness changes shape. It no longer feels only like a problem. It becomes part of the path. A difficult but necessary interruption, a breaking open, a summons to depth, a sacred refusal of a life that was functioning but no longer true. That is why some of the most transformative seasons begin with confusion. Because confusion is often what clarity feels like before it has language. Semicolon. Export. Const audio part 11 equals. So how does a good person actually begin to find their way again? Not in theory, not through slogans, not through one dramatic breakthrough, but in the real texture of ordinary life. It usually begins with truth-telling, not public truth first, private truth, the kind you speak in a quiet room, the kind you write down when no one is watching, the kind you admit before you know exactly what to do about it. I am more tired than I pretend. I am not as fulfilled as I look. I am afraid of disappointing people. I do not know what I want. I think I have confused being useful with being worthy. I am lonely in ways no one sees. I am carrying resentment I have not named. I am successful in some ways, but not at peace. I have been kind, but not always free. That kind of truth is destabilizing at first, but it is also holy, because nothing becomes whole until it becomes honest. The second step is learning to stay with discomfort long enough to understand it. Not every uncomfortable feeling is wisdom, but neither is every uncomfortable feeling something to escape. Some discomfort is the body and soul waking up from adaptation. Some discomfort is what happens when a person stops numbing. Some discomfort is what truth feels like when it enters a life built around performance. So instead of asking only, "How do I stop feeling this?" try asking, "What is this feeling protecting?" What is it revealing? What part of me is it trying to bring back into awareness? Then comes the work of small alignment. This matters more than most people think. People wait for one giant answer, one giant purpose, one giant revelation. But lasting change often begins through small, consistent acts that teach the soul it is now safe to live more truthfully. A real boundary spoken with kindness. A conversation you have postponed for too long. An apology that is honest and clean. A refusal to volunteer for what is not yours. A walk without distraction. A journal page where you stop editing yourself. A job decision shaped by meaning rather than image. A relationship where you practice mutuality instead of automatic overgiving. A moment of rest without calling it laziness. These things may sound small. They are not small. They are how identity changes. They are how a person stops abandoning themselves in real time. They are how lostness slowly gives way to integrity. Another important step is grieving accurately. Many people cannot find their way because they have not grieved what they had to become in order to survive. They have not grieved the childhood roles,
The years of pleasing, the silences, the choices made from fear, the relationships that shaped them around usefulness, the parts of themselves they left behind to stay safe. Without grief, the old patterns remain idealized. The person keeps thinking, maybe I just need to return to how I used to be. But often how they used to be was exactly what kept them fragmented. Grief lets them say, that version of me helped me survive. I do not hate that version, but I cannot remain there. It cost too much. That is a mature kind of compassion. It honors survival without worshiping it. It lets a person thank the old self and still move beyond it. The next step is learning to distinguish guilt from wisdom. This is crucial. Whenever good people change old relational patterns, guilt often appears automatically. They set a boundary and feel guilty. They say no and feel guilty. They stop over-explaining and feel guilty. They ask for reciprocity and feel guilty. They want a different life and feel guilty. But guilt is not always a moral alarm. Sometimes it is simply the nervous system reacting to unfamiliar truth. Wisdom asks better questions. Am I harming someone, or am I disappointing them? Am I abandoning responsibility, or am I refusing false responsibility? Am I becoming selfish, or am I finally including myself in the circle of care? Am I being cruel, or am I being clear? These questions protect a person from collapsing every time honesty creates discomfort, and they help goodness mature beyond people-pleasing. Then there is the step many people avoid because it is the most vulnerable. Letting yourself be known. Not by everyone, not indiscriminately, but somewhere, to someone safe, to a relationship, a therapist, a spiritual guide, a trusted friend, a journal, or even God in prayer. Somewhere the truth is spoken in full voice. A person cannot feel at home in life while remaining emotionally hidden everywhere. The soul needs witness. It needs at least one place where it is not reduced to a role. One place where it can be confused without being corrected too quickly. One place where it can be tired without being told to try harder. One place where it can be human without losing dignity. That kind of witness has extraordinary healing power. It interrupts shame.
It restores belonging. It reminds the person that they are not only lovable when composed. And once that begins, the inner system relaxes. The person no longer has to spend so much energy maintaining the image of being fine. There is also a deeper movement involved, reconnecting with something larger than the self. For some, this is explicitly spiritual. For others, it is moral vision. For others, nature, art, service,
or a sense of calling. Whatever form it takes, the human heart needs more than self-improvement. It needs participation in something that feels larger than ego and larger than performance. A life without that larger horizon often becomes claustrophobic. Everything becomes about management, tasks, schedules, output, impression. But a wider horizon restores perspective. It reminds a person they are not merely a machine for function. They are part of something meaningful, something living, something beyond constant self-monitoring. And then, perhaps most importantly, comes practice. Not inspiration alone, practice. Because a person does not find their way by feeling motivated once. They find it by practicing truth consistently enough that a new inner life becomes possible. Practicing rest, practicing honest speech, practicing saying less when over-explaining was once automatic, practicing letting silence exist without rushing to rescue it, practicing receiving care, practicing declining what violates the soul, practicing work that has meaning, practicing reflection, practicing gentleness with the self, practicing courage in small doses. This is how a lost person becomes a rooted person, not through instant certainty, but through repeated alignment. Each aligned act says, I am no longer abandoning myself here. I am no longer letting fear make every choice. I am no longer measuring worth only by usefulness. I am no longer calling exhaustion virtue. I am no longer pretending peace exists where truth is absent. Over time, those acts accumulate, and one day the person notices that their life still has uncertainty, but it no longer feels foreign. Their path is not fully mapped, but they no longer feel exiled from themselves. They are still growing, still grieving, still learning, but they have come home enough to keep walking. That is what many good people are really searching for. Not a life without questions. A life where the questions can exist without destroying belonging. A life where goodness is grounded, not performative. A life where meaning is felt, not merely admired. A life where honesty is allowed to become peace. And that kind of life is possible. Not instantly, not cheaply, but genuinely. One true step at a time. Part 12 equals, maybe that is the deepest truth hidden inside this whole reflection. Good people do not always feel lost because they lack goodness. Sometimes they feel lost because they have spent too many years giving goodness away without learning how to live from a whole self. They have been kind, but not always inwardly free. They have been responsible, but not always rooted. They have been compassionate, but not always connected to their own pain. They have been available, but not always honest. They have been admired, but not always known. They have been necessary, but not always alive. And eventually the soul grows tired of that arrangement, not because the person becomes selfish, but because the inner life can no longer survive on performance, duty, and borrowed meaning alone.
Something deeper begins asking to be chosen. Something quieter begins asking to be heard. Something long neglected begins knocking from within. That is often what lostness is: a knocking, a signal, a grief, a summons, a refusal to keep living only on the surface. So if you are one of those people, hear this gently. The fact that you feel lost does not mean your goodness was false. It does not mean your efforts meant nothing. It does not mean the years behind you were wasted. It means you may now be standing at a different threshold. A threshold where survival is no longer enough. A threshold where image is no longer enough. A threshold where usefulness is no longer enough. A threshold where your own soul is asking for a more honest life. That can feel frightening, because a more honest life changes things. It changes how you love. It changes what you say yes to. It changes what you tolerate. It changes how you define peace.
It changes the kind of success that impresses you. It changes the people you trust. It changes how you relate to your past. It changes what you believe you are allowed to need. But it also gives something back. It gives back coherence. It gives back significance. It gives back the ability to recognize yourself. It gives back a truer form of goodness, one that does not require hiding, one that does not confuse silence with wisdom, one that does not call exhaustion holiness, one that does not ask the soul to keep disappearing in order to stay lovable. There is a peace people often talk about that depends on circumstances. Everything working, everything making sense, everyone staying happy. No tension, no disruption, no difficult truth. That kind of peace is fragile, because life can break it very quickly. But there is another kind of peace, a deeper kind, a more durable kind. It does not come from controlling life. It comes from no longer running from yourself. It comes from the slow reconciliation of your outer life and your inner truth. It comes from courage, from grief faced honestly, from boundaries spoken kindly, from guilt transformed into wisdom, from love that includes the self, from purpose that reaches deeper than applause. It comes when you stop asking goodness to do the work only wholeness can do. And maybe that is the line worth remembering. Goodness matters deeply. But goodness is not the end of the journey. The journey is wholeness. The journey is becoming a person whose goodness is rooted in truth, nourished by meaning, softened by grace, strengthened by boundaries, and alive with purpose. That is why some of the most beautiful transformations began not in certainty, but in lostness. Because lostness strips away old illusions. It reveals where the life no longer fits. It exposes where the role became too tight. It names where the soul was underfed. And then, if a person is willing, it opens a different road. A road toward being known. A road toward living from the center. A road toward choosing a life that feels inhabited. A road toward love that does not erase selfhood. A road toward peace that does not depend on pretending. So if you are listening to this and something inside you feels tired, restless, or quietly far away, do not rush to condemn yourself. Do not call your hunger ingratitude too quickly. Do not call your exhaustion weakness too quickly.
Do not call your longing selfishness too quickly. Do not call your questions failure too quickly. Stay with them a little longer. Listen more carefully. There may be grief there. There may be truth there. There may be pain that needs witness. There may be courage trying to awaken.
There may be a more honest life waiting just on the other side of what feels frightening now. You may not have all the answers yet. That is all right. Clarity often begins before language. Healing often begins before confidence. Wholeness often begins with one small refusal. The refusal to keep abandoning yourself, one boundary, one honest sentence, one conversation, one confession, one grieving prayer, one moment of silence where you stop pretending. One decision to no longer measure your worth only by what you carry for others. One step toward a life that feels true enough for the soul to breathe in. That is how the return often happens, not all at once, but unmistakably. A little more truth, a little more courage, a little more self-respect, a little less performance, a little less borrowed purpose, a little less fear of being seen. And then one day the question changes. It is no longer only, why do I feel so lost? It becomes, what kind of life is now possible because I finally stopped lying to myself? What kind of peace is now possible because I no longer need to disappear? What kind of love is now possible because I can remain present too? What kind of goodness is now possible because it is finally free? That may be where the real answer lives. Not in becoming less good, but in becoming good from a place that is no longer divided. Not in carrying more, but in living truer. Not in being admired, but in being whole. And perhaps that is what the heart was asking for all along. Not perfection, not non-stop strength, not endless approval, not a life with no pain. Just this, a life that feels real enough to belong to, a life where truth and love can meet, a life where grace reaches inward too, a life where the soul no longer has to ask in secret, where did I go? Because at last, slowly, quietly, honestly, you have begun to come home.